the silent caller. I moved to Millfield, a small, quiet town that hardly shows up on a map, right after my breakup. My name's George, by the way. I figured a change of scenery would help me get over the mess I left behind. I rented a modest apartment in an old building that creaked and groaned like it had secrets to tell. My life here was pretty uneventful, just the way I wanted it. I worked at a local office, kept to myself mostly, and tried to put my past behind me. Every night, after work, I'd cook a simple dinner, watch some TV, and then head to bed early. It was my new routine, a way to keep my mind off things. See, my ex, Jessica, had left me for someone else, and it hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I guess I was afraid of being alone, of being abandoned again. That's the deep secret I try to hide, even from myself. One Thursday night, I was half asleep when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen showed an unknown number, but I answered it anyway. "Hello?" I mumbled, still groggy. Silence. I could hear my own breathing, but nothing else. After a few moments, I hung up, thinking it was a wrong number. I didn't think much of it and went back to sleep. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same unknown number, same silence. I was more alert this time. "Hello? Who is this?" I repeated, each time with growing frustration. But the only response was the silence on the other end. I hung up and felt a shiver run down my spine. I told my friend Lisa about it the next day. We were grabbing coffee and I tried to laugh it off, but I think she could see I was a bit spooked. "Sounds like a prank, George. Maybe some kid's messing around," she said, stirring her coffee. "But you know, with your luck, it could be anything." She added with a small chuckle. "Yeah, probably," I replied, trying to sound casual. "But it's just weird, you know?" Lisa shrugged. "If it keeps happening, maybe you should tell the cops, just in case." I nodded, but I didn't really think it was worth bothering the police over. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it left me with. That night, the call came again. I was expecting it this time, so I let it ring a few times before picking up. "Hello? Hello?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. I strained to hear anything. Breathing, background noise, anything. But it was just silent. I hung up and stared at the phone for a long time, feeling a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach. The next few nights were the same. Every night at exactly 3:15 a.m., my phone would ring, and I'd be greeted with that unnerving silence. I started to dread going to bed, knowing I'd be jolted awake by that eerie call. Blocking the number didn't help. The calls just came from different unknown numbers. As the nights went on, I found myself becoming more and more paranoid. Every little sound in my apartment seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, the rustle of the curtains, they all set my nerves on edge. One night, I was woken not by a call, but by a loud thump coming from the apartment above mine. I groaned, rolling over to check the time. 3:15 a.m. Great, I thought. Just great. The calls continued, and my sleep-deprived mind started playing tricks on me. I'd find items in my apartment slightly moved, doors ajar that I was sure I'd closed, and sometimes I'd catch fleeting shadows in the corner of my eye. My fear of being alone, of being watched, crept back into my life with a vengeance. One evening, after another sleepless night, I bumped into my elderly neighbor, Mr. Thompson, in the hallway. He was a reclusive man who rarely left his apartment, but today he seemed oddly chatty. "Evening, George," he said, his voice raspy. "You look like you've seen better days." I forced a smile. "Yeah, just haven't been sleeping well." He gave me a strange look, his eyes narrowing. "You be careful now. This building has history. Sometimes it's best not to answer the calls." I blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" But he just shook his head and shuffled away, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. The unease I felt grew stronger. Who was making those calls? And what did Mr. Thompson mean by history? I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And so, my nights continued to be haunted by those silent calls, each one driving me closer to the edge of my sanity. The calls kept coming, and each one gnawed at my sanity a little more. I started to feel like a prisoner in my own home, jumping at every noise, expecting the phone to ring at any moment. The more I tried to ignore it, the more the silence seemed to close in around me. One night, after another sleepless stretch, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The streets of Millfield were empty and quiet, the only sound the distant hum of streetlights and the occasional rustle of leaves. I hoped the fresh air would calm my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I rounded the corner to head back to my apartment, I saw a figure standing in the shadows across the street. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me. My heart raced, and I quickened my pace, glancing back, only to find the figure gone. When I got back to my building, the hallway lights flickered as I made my way to my apartment. I paused at my door, fumbling with the keys, when I heard a soft, distant whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it sent chills down my spine. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The next day at work, I was a mess. My coworker, Sam, noticed my frazzled state and pulled me aside during lunch. "George, you look like you haven't slept in days. What's going on?" Sam asked, concern evident in his voice. I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. "It's these phone calls I've been getting, every night at the same time. It's always silent, but really getting to me." Sam frowned. "That's creepy, man. Have you told the cops?" "Yeah, but they think it's just prank calls. They asked me to set up a recorder, which I did, but it hasn't helped. It's like the calls are too close, you know?" He nodded slowly, then glanced around as if to make sure no one was listening. "You should talk to Mrs. Walker. She's been living in that building for decades. If anyone knows what's going on, it's her." That evening, I took Sam's advice and knocked on Mrs. Walker's door. She was an elderly woman, kind but with a stern presence. When I explained my situation, she invited me in and offered me a cup of tea. "You're not the first to experience strange things in this building," she said, her voice low and serious. "I've seen tenants come and go, some leaving in the dead of night, never to return." "What do you mean?" I asked, gripping the warm cup tightly. "There's something unsettling about this place," she continued. "I've heard whispers, seen shadows, and those phone calls you're getting. They've happened before, to others. Did they ever find out who was making them?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Walker shook her head. "No, and those who tried to find out usually left before they could get any answers. My advice to you, George, is to be careful. Don't dig too deep." Her words lingered in my mind as I left her apartment. That night, I found it difficult to sleep, Mrs. Walker's warnings echoing in my ears. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the darkness feeling heavier than usual. At 3:15 a.m., my phone rang. My hand trembled as I reached for it. "Hello?" I said, my voice cracking. Silence. I strained to hear anything, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, ever so faintly, I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper. "Leave." I bolted upright, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was my imagination. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. The building's eerie history, the warnings from Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Walker, it all pointed to something sinister lurking just beneath the surface. The next morning, I decided to install a recording device as the police suggested, hoping to capture some clue about the caller. As I set it up, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around my apartment, every shadow and corner suddenly seeming more menacing. Days passed, and the calls continued, each one eroding my sanity a bit more. The recording device captured only silence, but I knew there was something there. Something just unreachable. My once peaceful apartment now felt like a prison, and I was trapped with an unseen tormentor. The days turned into a blur of exhaustion and fear. I dreaded the nights, knowing the silent calls would come, leaving me sleepless and on edge. My work started to suffer. My boss, Mr. Harris, called me into his office one afternoon. "George, you've been slipping lately," he said, his brow furrowed with concern. "Is everything all right at home?" I wanted to tell him everything, but I knew how it would sound. "I'm just dealing with some personal stuff, Mr. Harris. It'll get better." He sighed, clearly not convinced. "Take care of yourself, George. We need you here, but you need to be at your best." "Thanks, I'll try," I replied, forcing a weak smile. After work, I met up with Lisa again. We sat in our usual spot at the coffee shop, but this time the conversation was far from lighthearted. "George, you look like you've been through hell," Lisa said, worry etched across her face. "You need to do something about these calls." "I've tried everything," I said, my voice tinged with frustration. "The police, the recordings, nothing helps. I feel like I'm losing my mind." "Maybe you should stay with someone for a while. Get out of that apartment," she suggested. I shook my head. "I can't leave. I need to know what's happening. And besides, it's like I can't escape it." Lisa reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm here for you, George. We'll figure this out together." Her support meant the world to me, but it didn't ease the dread that filled me every night. The calls continued, and the whispers grew more distinct. I was sure now that they were saying, "Leave, now." One particularly bad night, I decided to confront Mr. Thompson again. I knocked on his door, my heart racing. He opened it slowly, peering at me with a knowing look. "You didn't listen, did you?" he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "What do you mean?" I demanded, frustration boiling over. "What's going on in this building?" Mr. Thompson sighed, looking both weary and resigned. "There are things in this world, George, that we can't explain. Some places, they hold on to dark memories. This building is one of them. The calls are a warning." "A warning of what?" I asked, desperate for answers. "That something terrible happened here, and if you don't leave, it'll happen to you too," he replied, closing the door before I could ask more. I walked back to my apartment, his words ringing in my ears. Something terrible happened here. What could it be? I felt a sudden urge to dig deeper, to uncover the building's past. I started researching, spending hours at the local library, looking through old newspapers and records. What I found was chilling. Decades ago, a tenant in my apartment had gone mad, driven to the brink by incessant phone calls that no one else could hear. He had eventually taken his own life. The knowledge weighed heavy on me, but it also steeled my resolve. I had to find out who, or what, was behind these calls. That night, as I lay in bed, the phone rang again. I picked it up, not even bothering to check the number. "What do you want from me?" I shouted into the phone, my voice echoing in the silence. For the first time, there was a response. A faint, chilling whisper. "Leave? Now? Before? It's too late." My blood ran cold. I hung up and sat there, my mind racing. The calls weren't just random. They were a warning, a desperate plea for me to get out. I called Lisa, needing to hear a friendly voice. "Lisa, I need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "Something terrible happened in this building, and it's happening again." "George, calm down. Where are you? I'll come get you," she replied, her voice filled with concern. "No, it's not safe. I have to figure this out. I have to know who's doing this," I insisted, my fear mixing with determination. "Just be careful, George. Promise me," Lisa said softly. "I will." "Thanks, Lisa," I said, feeling a bit more grounded after our conversation. The calls, the whispers, the history of my apartment, all of it pointed to something dark and dangerous. but I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The weight of what I'd discovered hung over me like a storm cloud. The calls, the whispers, the history of my apartment, they were all pieces of a terrifying puzzle. But there was one piece still missing, the identity of the caller. I had to confront this head-on. I decided to investigate the basement. Mrs. Walker mentioned that some tenants had vanished down there. The basement was always locked, but I'd seen the superintendent, Mr. Davis, use a key from his office. I waited until late at night when I knew he'd be asleep, then crept into the building's office and took the key. The basement was dark and musty, filled with old, forgotten furniture and cobweb-covered corners. I held my phone's flashlight in front of me, its beam cutting through the darkness. My heart pounded with each step. As I ventured deeper, I noticed something strange, an old phone line, its cords snaking along the wall, leading to a small, hidden room at the back. My stomach churned as I approached. The door creaked open, revealing a room filled with old phone equipment, wires, and dusty recording devices. In the center of the room stood a single chair, facing an array of ancient-looking phones. It looked like a twisted command center. My skin crawled as I realized this was where the calls were coming from. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. My phone's flashlight flickered, then died. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to turn it back on. When the light finally came back, Mr. Thompson stood in the doorway, his eyes glinting with a malevolent gleam. "You shouldn't have come here, George," he said, his voice cold and menacing. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What happened here?" Mr. Thompson stepped closer, his expression twisted with anger and something else. Pain. "I was just like you once, new to the building, curious. I found this room just like you did. The calls started, and I couldn't leave. It drove me mad, and now I'm trapped here, just like the others before me." "Others? What do you mean?" I asked, fear gripping me. "The spirits of those who couldn't escape. We're bound to this place, and the calls are our warning to you. But you didn't listen," he said, his voice breaking. "Is there any way to stop this, to free you?" I asked, desperate for a solution. Mr. Thompson shook his head. "Once you're in, there's no way out. The building feeds on our fear, our despair. You're part of it now, George. You're one of us." "No, there has to be a way," I insisted, backing away. He sighed. "The only way to break the cycle is to make someone else take your place. That's why we make the calls, to drive the next tenant to madness. It's the only way to end our suffering." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Mr. Thompson and the others were victims just like me. The building's malevolence forced them to continue the cycle. I had a choice to make: succumb to the building's curse, or find a way to end it for good. I couldn't do to someone else what had been done to me. Gathering my courage, I made a break for the door, shoving past Mr. Thompson. I ran through the basement, up the stairs, and back to my apartment. I grabbed my phone and called Lisa. "Lisa, I need your help," I said, my voice shaking. "George, what's wrong? Where are you?" she asked, panic in her voice. "I'm at my apartment. Please, just come." "I'll explain everything," I said, my breath coming in gasps. "Okay, I'm on my way," she replied. When she arrived, I briefly explained everything. The calls, the basement, Mr. Thompson, everything. "We have to leave, George. Now," Lisa said, urgency in her voice. But as we were about to leave, the phone rang. 3:15 a.m. I hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling. "Leave. Now." The whisper came, more urgent than ever. I hung up and turned to Lisa. "We have to destroy the phone equipment in the basement. It's the only way to stop the calls." She nodded, and we headed back to the basement together. With Lisa's help, we smashed the old phones, cut the wires, and tore apart the equipment. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifting as we destroyed the source of the calls. We left the building, the early morning light breaking over the horizon. I felt a strange sense of peace, hoping we had ended the cycle. But as we drove away, my phone buzzed. A new message. I unlocked it, and my blood ran cold. See you soon.